to some supposedly necessary proposition if its negation is really impossible. It seems as if you're ruling the negation as guilty straight off the bat, and it's impossible. So you're clearly not consistently applying the maximum if you're saying, well, there's nothing against it being necessary, when you don't realize that construed positively, you're denying that its negation is possible. You're saying that its negation is impossible. So Plantinga is simply misapplying the supposed maxim that he's talking about. And plainly, it is a tall order to show that maximal excellence not being exemplified is impossible. Otherwise, you could show a whole host of these things, and all sorts of arguments being quote-unquote rationally acceptable. It's necessary that matter exists, hence matter exists. It's necessary that dualism is false, hence dualism is false. It's necessary that unicorns exist, hence unicorns exist. It's necessary that golden mountains exist, hence golden mountains exist. It's necessary that mind is purely matter, hence mind is purely matter. It's necessary that morality is subjective, hence morality is subjective. It's necessary that X, therefore X. So there's no room for rational acceptability to be ventured here. Necessity isn't just simply to be imagined or fashioned or granted by fiat. It's not to be just simply granted into existence. Okay? Instead, a contradiction follows from the negation of a proposition. And you should also be careful before concluding that apparent conceivability entails logical possibility with respect to logical necessity. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, consider mathematics. All propositions there are necessary, but clearly it's certainly in some sense conceivable that these true propositions are in fact wrong. Consider, for instance, people here have taken math classes, right? You know the time where we like let's say you take calculus or you take geometry or algebra 2 or something, where we go through some really long equation and get to some answer that we're so confident is right. Okay, so we think it's right, and certainly in this sense we're conceiving that the proposition that we've just written down, more accurately, that the sentence that we've written down and the proposition it expresses is true. We're so sure of that, and so we're conceiving that possibility right there. Okay. However, that answer is wrong. That happens to us all the time, right? People remember those mathematical nightmares, right? Yeah. Okay. So, in that same sense, we can conceive necessary falsities, because what we just wrote down right there was a necessarily false proposition, because all mathematical propositions are analytic tautologies. So we have to distinguish, as I said earlier, between epistemic and modal possibility. And I think we should rightly hesitate to label things as necessary unless it can be rigorously shown that a proposition's negation entails a contradiction. However, what about the present case? No contradiction is entailed by maximal excellence not being exemplified. In other words, there's no contradiction entailed by God's not existing. Therefore, 29, it's not necessary that G. In other words, it's not necessary that maximal excellence is exemplified. And then from that, no ontological argument to God's actual existence can be made, since that maximal excellence is necessarily exemplified is the crucial premise of any ontological argument. Okay? Moreover, that since modal propositions, I'm going to argue that it's basically inconceivable, okay, that these type of things could be necessary. Alright? Under modal propositions, under S5, and possible world semantics are necessary. In other words, it's intrinsically part of the concept, okay, more actually part of the abstract object, maximal excellence being exemplified, as its exemplification being contingent. Okay? Hence, the notion of it being necessary that maximal excellence being exemplified expresses that the proposition maximal excellence is exemplified is both non-necessary and necessary. Because maximal excellence being exemplified is non-necessary, however, it necessarily being exemplified also means that it's necessary. Hence, it's necessary and non-necessary. Therefore, maximal excellence being necessarily exemplified is incoherent. And in other words, maximal greatness being exemplified is incoherent. So contrary to Plantinga's comments, it's totally irrational to accept these premises here, because they're incoherent. It's an intrinsic modal property that maximal excellence being exemplified is non-necessary. Hence, it can't be necessary. Okay? In other words, if it was necessary, then it would be both necessary and non-necessary. And this is the same reason why necessary unicorn, necessary golden mountains, necessary X, so on and so forth, are impossible. Because it's part of the concept of X as being non-necessary. Therefore, to say necessarily X is to say that X is both necessary and non-necessary, a contradiction. Now, I can see three different broad responses to what I've said here. The first response I could see is that, well, okay, look, it's part of the definition or the concept of a necessary God to exist. Therefore, God exists. In other words, a necessary God is necessarily existent. A necessarily existent is existent. Therefore, God's existent. However, as Peter Van Inwagen points out in his book Metaphysics, from pages 94 to 97, this confuses two different arguments. The argument, a necessary God is necessarily existent, a necessarily existent being is existent, does not entail that there is a necessary God. It entails that if there were a necessary God, then there would be a necessary God. This is clearly true, okay, but it's true by definition. It would be true even if there were no necessary God. For instance, all unicorns have one horn is true even though there are no unicorns. The same is true for all necessary unicorns are necessarily existent even though there are no necessarily existent unicorns. So the only way this argument can succeed is by pointing out there is a necessary God, hence there is a necessary God. But like arguments A and B, this has no persuasive force when we're back where we started. Why suppose there's a necessary God? Or, to put it more under a metaphysical slant, that something is part of the definition, that some concept is part of the definition of something, doesn't entail that anything exemplifies a concept or satisfies a definition. A round square by definition is both round and square, but nothing exemplifies or can exemplify or satisfy the definition as such. This is because such concepts express concepts of impossible entities. Necessary unicorns, nothing exemplifies or satisfies a definition because it's an intrinsic modal property of a unicorn as being non-necessary. Hence, a necessary unicorn is both necessary and non-necessary. So this reply simply answers nothing at all. It simply dodges the point about the incoherence of there being a necessary God. Now, second, perhaps the defender of the modal ontological argument is impressed by Gödelian and Leibnizian arguments of the sort. Leibniz basically offered the sort of argument that he realized, quite rightly, that any successful ontological argument must include a proof of the coherence of a necessary God. And he had an abstract metaphysical argument for this conclusion. Okay. All positive properties are compatible with each other. For instance, the property red is compatible with the property round. Necessary existence is a positive property, hence it's possible that God possesses necessary existence, hence God exists. Okay, now there's a lot that can be said about this argument, and I'll only restrict myself to some objections that seem pretty successful to me. As Peter Van Inwagen points out in Metaphysics, page 109, it's unclear whether properties are intrinsically positive or negative. I mean, consider a property not having parts, as Van Inwagen points out. Leibniz says that this is a positive property, simplicity, but at the same time it would seem to not have parts is a negative property. But under this construal, simplicity, therefore, would be a negative property, and having parts would be a positive property. But Leibniz would say that simplicity is the positive property, and having parts would then be a negative property. Okay? So positivity and negativity aren't intrinsic to properties. It's just a way of looking at things. So his argument doesn't work. Okay? And also, necessity isn't any ordinary kind of property. It's a modal property, and more particularly, a trans-world property. An object is necessary if and only if it exists in all possible worlds, and it can only do that if and only if its non-existence is contradictory. So you can't